Hey everyone, and welcome to Three Black Women and Their White Coach,
a podcast where we have a conversation around navigating race in the coaching industry.
And we're your hosts.
I'm Catrice Stetson, your mixed race internet bestie and serial entrepreneur who's built multiple businesses from the ground up.
And I'm Brianna Lachelle, your biracial nonprofit coach whose focus is on helping support nonprofit leaders and founders create impact-driven organizations that radically change their communities for the better.
Here at Three Black Women and Their White Coach, we dive into hard conversations centered around racial inequity within the coaching space with softness and grace.
Our hearts are to open up these conversations and create a safe space for people to be seen, learn, and create a better, more inclusive environment for all.
So pull up a chair, your favorite snack, and a bevy while you yap with your new biz besties as we work to make the coaching industry a place where we all feel welcome and respected.
In this episode, we're talking about something that's been misunderstood and honestly disrespected for a long time, the way Black people speak. Because the reality is, language has always been tied to perception. And for Black people, how we speak is often used to decide how intelligent, professional, or even credible we're seen as, before we even get a chance to be understood. So today we're unpacking Ebonics, also known as African American Vernacular English, and why it's not broken English, it's not slang, and it's definitely not something that needs to be fixed. It's a dialect, it's a system, and it's been policed, mocked, and misunderstood for generations, especially in spaces like coaching, where how you sound can impact how seriously you're taken. We're going to talk about it, where it came from, how it shows up, and what it actually means.
Before we dive in, we want to ground this conversation by sharing our intentions, as we always do at the start of an episode. This isn't about debating what's right or wrong when it comes to English, and it's not about shaming anyone for what they were taught in school and what they're used to hearing. What we're doing is unpacking the bias behind what gets labeled as professional, articulate, or correct, and who gets excluded in that process. We're speaking from our lived experiences, not as the voice for all Black people. There's nuance here, just like there always is in everything else. So as you listen, we're inviting you to come in with curiosity instead of correction and to notice where your assumptions about language might be shaping how you see the world around you.
And so I think the best place for us to start is to really talk about what is Ebonics. And so to give you a clear definition, Ebonics is the slang term for African American Vernacular English, or AAVE. It's a rule-governed, structured dialect of English with its own grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. So it's really important to understand it's not slang, it's not lazy English, there's not a lack of education happening. It is important for us to realize that linguistics actually recognize AAVE as a legitimate dialect. It follows constant grammatical patterns. It's not just random. And so there's lots of different ways that this can show up. You want to talk about that, Catrice?
Yeah. So some examples of talking points could be the habitual be. So she be working does not necessarily equal she is working right now. Or there's double negatives as emphasis, as well as the omission of words such as is and are in certain contexts. Now, there are historical roots and context to this where it is rooted in Western African languages as well as Southern American English. It was developed during slavery when enslaved Africans blended languages under forced conditions. It ultimately evolved through the segregation and Black communities forming their own cultural and linguistic identities. A critical moment that I want to really highlight is the Oakland Ebonics resolution. So during this, it was recognized that Ebonics was a primary language for many Black students and sparked this national outrage of misunderstanding exactly what this was. Was it broken English? Was it a different language? All these different things. But ultimately, what this resolution brought forth was this exposing of a deep bias about language and intelligence, where just because you spoke a certain way, even though you were communicating the same things that other people were, that because of how you were stating it, you were then seen as different or maybe unintelligent. But really, it's not just about language. It's about who is respected when it comes to language. And I think that is where this conversation gets kind of sticky for some people, where there's this misunderstanding, is where it comes to this point where it all depends on where you grew up. I mean, Brianna lives down in New Mexico. I live in the PNW up in Seattle. Like even in the way that we have conversations nowadays in our dear Lord Savior year of 2026, like people across the US still speak, we talk about accents all the time, but there is still like
Mhm.
cultural language that is shifted. That's kind of why we wanted to talk about Ebonics today, because I think that it's such a hot topic. And I mean, Brianna and I have been sharing back and forth so many TikToks because it is becoming trendy as a topic.
Yeah, yeah, and it's really interesting, right? Because especially, I mean, when we were thinking about what things we wanted to talk about this season, Ebonics came up, and I was like, when I was in school, I mean, in elementary school, a lot of the things that are actually AAVE was taught to me as wrong, and so it's really interesting that even not even 20 years ago, we were still having this conversation of whether or not Ebonics were proper English or not, and so I think that this really comes into play when we're talking about professional settings, coaching settings, and really trying to make an inclusive space for other people is to understand that different people, depending on where they grew up, what their home life is like, what part of the country they live in, they might speak differently, and not to make assumptions based on how people speak. Especially if you don't understand the context of why it is that way. And so, yeah, I think that that's really interesting because I know even, from my own perspective, there's been times that I would think that someone was speaking improperly, and that tells in my head that would tell me something about, how smart they were, where they grew up, what they were into, when in all actuality, I was taught something that was false, that just because they're speaking in this particular dialect doesn't mean that it's improper English, which I think is really interesting, especially being a biracial woman.
Yeah, I also think it's like very interesting things that we are so quick to correct versus things that are also taken as like a blanket, okay, we'll accept this, but we won't accept something else. Like ain't, for instance, like growing up, and even to this day, my mom still will, one of my sisters, ain't is definitely a big word in her vocabulary. And my mom will be like, that's not correct
Proper.
English. Like, that's not how. Like we would properly say it, and I think that's so interesting because also at the same time, in some contexts, people are just like, yeah, ain't is a word. Like that just is dialect. It's so, I mean, language is fascinating. Just, I, before recording this episode, before we hopped on here, I was scrolling through threads and I saw a copywriter who was talking about punctuation. And it made me think, I was like, oh my gosh, how crazy that we're doing this episode today, because she was talking about where punctuation goes in quotations and how it should always be in the quotation. But then I saw someone who commented about for Spanish and Portuguese, and they mentioned another language. Oh, and in the UK, that's not how they write, which is also interesting because she brought up the UK where English is like the primary language. But the way that we even just write, this copywriter, I mean, there was no harm, there was no malice behind it, but it was like, this is the correct way. But it was also like, well, in other English speaking country, like literally in another English speaking country, that's not how they write.
Right, right. Which makes it gives me the question, like, okay, what is actually correct and what is just biases that we're creating that either makes us feel better or worse about a person, right?
Yeah, no, and it's like things like that with, looking at AAVE, looking at, you know, grammar and how we do punctuation and everything. It's so interesting because it also shows you, you know, this is about to be a wild take, but how made up everything is.
Yeah.
Like the constructs of everything is just like someone one day was like, well, that's not how you say that. Like that's incorrect. Or you shouldn't be your punctuation needs to be within the quotations if you do a quote. Like the fact that it's just one of those things where you're like, wow, everything is just like someone just one day said this is what it is and we all decided, okay, I guess that's what we're following.
Right, right. Well, and what was also really interesting to me is that, when I was growing up, AABE was like made out to be as it was just like Black people making up stuff, right? Black people choosing to
Yeah.
not speak correctly, when in actuality, there is like rules and systems associated with this dialect. It's not just people just throwing spaghetti at the wall, which I think also really helps me like it helped me realize when we were doing the research for this is that just because it's not the like majority doesn't mean that it's any less valuable or any less correct, which I think is a piece that can kind of get missed sometimes is that, when you're not the majority, um, everybody makes the assumption that you're wrong, right? Like if you're not doing what everybody else is doing, then people assume that like what you're doing must be bad or wrong or not it.
Mhm.
And in actuality, we can see that like different just because there's a different system that you don't understand doesn't mean that it's wrong. And I think that that's a really tricky state that we kind of have to reprogram our mind that just because you're not familiar with it doesn't automatically mean that there's something wrong happening. And just because you're not familiar with it doesn't take away the value of having the system.
And also taking a second, like if you're on a coaching call or a call with anyone, this doesn't just have to be in the coaching space, but if someone says something and they don't quite say it in a way that you register as like proper or how you were taught, taking a second, taking a beat to process it before you go and make a correction. I think
Yeah.
that is also something, that makes me think of I mean, pronouns are a big thing right now and making sure that you're using correct pronouns. But, like, there's a time and a place to correct someone in a way that it builds for more connection versus like tearing them down.
Yeah.
And I think that that is like a thing with like Ebonics where if you hear something and you're like that to you sounds like broken English, like take a second to be like why assess and audit and reflect to yourself in that moment to be like, why do I think that? Is like also we are so quick to give grace to those who English is not their primary language when they have broken English. But Ebonics is something that, kind of like we talked about, stems from slavery and this culture, this language came about in American society, but it wasn't the rich and proper American society. But that means that those of us who grew up with, who have Black ancestry, that is just part of our dialect. That
Yeah.
is when you go over to grandma and grandpa's, that is just how they speak because that's how their parents spoke to them and their parents before them. And I think that like taking that into account, because I think that something we do just as a collective is we are so quick to correct someone when it's not correct or to us, but then also who we give grace to and who we don't. When we know that someone is, from a like a Latin American country and English was not their first language, or they're coming over from Asia and they have broken English, it's like, oh, okay, like that makes sense. We'll kind of just let it slide. But I find that like, reflecting on experiences growing up, how often did you sit in a classroom where the Black student who was just speaking as if they were speaking at home was corrected for something that ultimately was, and again, it's like, what is the definition of proper? But like proper to them.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think right now I feel like we've been talking like such high level, which is really important, but I
Yeah.
think it might also be really helpful to give some examples. And so
Yeah.
I know me and you took some time to find some of those key rules of AAVE and examples. So I think this would be a good time to kind of go through some of them. So the first one on our list was the habitual be. And so this is one that is constantly misused. And so the rule is be, means something regularly or habitually, not necessarily right now. So an example is she be late, which means she is usually late. They be outside. So they are often outside. You be acting different. you tend to act differently. And so the contrast is she's late means that she's late right now, but she be late is means that that's her pattern. She's always late. And so if you're using the be incorrectly, Black people are going to notice it because you don't understand the rule behind it. And so I think that that's a really interesting, because that's something that, like, I know when we were looking at these rules, one of the things I was saying, I was like, wow, I didn't realize that me and my family say things like this regularly, but I don't say this in like certain settings. So like in a professional
Yeah.
setting, I would never be like, oh yeah, she be late all the time. Because that doesn't,
Yeah.
that's not, yeah, it's the code switching, which if you don't know, if you want to learn more about code switching, go check out season 1, episode 2. We did a whole podcast episode about it. But it's the code switching piece. But when you like actually look at the rules of AAVE, you're like, wow, that's where that comes from. It's not just like my family goofing off and being lazy. It's like there's an actual reasoning behind it. So I thought that was really cool.
I also, yeah, and in that, like, the habitual be. So I grew up in Seattle, born and raised Seattleite, but I didn't hear that as often
Mm,
in school.
right,
But
yeah.
when I travel down to the South and I visit my family, and it's the Black side of my family that lives down in the South, like, that is such common language
Hmm.
where, again, kind of a little culture shock that it's like, for me being coming from Seattle, where it's like, oh, like, there are lots of people who, talk in this habitual state where it's not just they are always. It's also so interesting, the shortening of things. I'm like, yes, I mean, less words. But how we talk in habitual states of like, she be working, like, and that is also a term of like endearment and empowerment.
Hmm.
It's not a tear down always,
Right.
like, yes, she be working, like she's
She
going
works
and she's getting her
hard. She
bag,
does it. Yeah, she grinds.
like she's doing the thing, like. And I think that's like another thing with it is like this, the context
Yeah.
where someone who isn't fully um in the know of how it plays in like actual dialogue. I think there's one thing to read a rule book, but then there's actually the tone and inflection that comes with it, where someone outside can easily be like, oh, when you say she be working, you're like, oh, okay, like she's working.
Hmm.
But like, I, a context, when I say something like that, especially that particular phrase, it's like, oh, she's getting the bag, she's doing
Yeah,
the
she's
thing.
doing her thing. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's an important piece too, is to understand like the cultural context of different, like especially when we're talking about this, the language, because you can't read it for face value, right? So like if you're not really aware, then you're going to miss those like subliminal messages that your clients or the people that you're
Mm-hmm.
talking to is trying to say.
Yeah. No, it's like, again, that piece of like taking a second to reflect. And I think, I mean, I don't know if you've been talked to about this, and I mean, this is also therapy, years of therapy, but are you listening to understand, or are you listening because you are listening to respond to someone? And
Right.
taking that time to really be like, am I listening for understanding on so many different contexts, from what they're actually saying to how they're saying it? Or am I listening because I'm ready to respond to them?
Right.
And I think, especially in the coaching setting, especially when you're sitting in that coaching seat, you're listening to someone as they're rattling off, things that they're troubleshooting, their goals, all these, they're in a coaching session, and you're listening because you're like, okay, I need to respond. But also, there is no harm in taking a second to be like, let me actually take a second, take a beat, process what I'm hearing. What am I understanding from this? I mean, and this goes as like coaching in general is like really taking a second to process and digest what is being told to you before I respond. So then you're able to come from this place of like understanding and being like, okay, I took a second, I processed everything. Maybe you are asking a question of clarification before you make a statement, especially if you heard something and you didn't quite understand what they
Yeah.
meant by that.
Yeah. And I think that that's good practice just in general, but especially when you're dealing with clients that, have a different cultural background. If you're not sure exactly what they're meaning, or if you are kind of leading with the assumption that whatever they're saying is incorrect, I think that is a place for you to pause and like ask for clarification and really open yourself to the idea that maybe the cultural context that they're coming from doesn't match yours, and that doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that you need more context and to be able to support them or to be able to fully understand what they're saying. And there's nothing wrong with that.
And I think a good thing on like the taking time to understand is something like a double negative or a negative inversion, where someone is going to employ multiple negatives, like saying she don't got no money. It's not in math, we talk about like cancellations.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Ebonics and AAVE, it is a emphasis of that negative. Can't nobody do that? Like, is it true that nobody can do this? Like the actual, taking a second when someone, especially I think the double negatives, because I think that sometimes, again, we are taught in math this universal language of a double negative cancels each other out. And when we are looking at Ebonics, we are looking at is this person trying to make emphasis?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is like, what are, again, that inflection, that point of like, when you're hearing someone and they say something in a way where there is a double negative, sometimes even a triple negative, depending on like the state of what is happening, taking that moment to understand, like, what are they actually trying to communicate in this moment?
And emphasis is huge in AAVE. Another one that comes to mind for me is been. So, the stressed been means something that's been true for a long time. It doesn't mean like the immediate word. So, like, an example of that is like, oh, I been knew that, which means I've known that for a long time, not like I just found out about it. It's not that like, oh, this is a surprise. It's like, oh no, this has been a fact. So like, another example would be like, she's been married. Like, she's been married. This is not new information. You're late to the party. And so how a person emphasizes that been also gives you context about how they feel about it. Whether the information is tea, whether it's like something like, yeah, girl, this is gonna cause some drama in the chat. Like, and that's, and I think it's really beautiful because in so many ways in Black culture, words and how people say words really kind of emote context and gives you even more of the story if you're listening correctly. But if you're listening with the ears of, oh, I need to correct them because they have improper English, then you miss everything that your client or whoever you're talking to is trying to communicate to you. And that can be a breakdown in the relationship, right? If you're constantly trying to correct someone when they're actually like inviting you into this narrative and this full story that they're trying to tell you by using their language and using their culture, then you break down that relationship building that could be happening if you are more aware of the situation.
Yeah. And I think that something else, with AAVE is also, to go slightly off the path, but still connected to the way that, the history for Black people and our language and linguistics is also, there are so many Black sayings.
Mm.
And it's so easy to not necessarily understand, like, I'm like, for instance, we all like, make it make sense is a very common statement. Like that I use it in my actual, like, I am pretty sure I have it in my Instagram bio, like my personal Instagram bio. Like, it's a it's like I can help you do XYZ and make it make sense as well as dollars, something like
Right.
that. Like it's, a little play on words. But also the Black sayings where, you know, they sound a little funny, but they have a deeper meaning to them. Like, I'm not one of your little friends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That sounds very aggressive. And someone, on the sitting on the opposing side of someone saying that, like, that can sound like aggression. You're like, whoa, whoa. But ultimately, it's more of a boundary set. There's a difference between familiarity and respect. And I think that that's another thing that comes with it is like when talking about AAVE, there's also there's a dialect that has rules, but also there are Black sayings that, again, kind of what you were talking about, the inflection, the emphasis, those things all play into like that deeper understanding of what is someone trying to communicate. And even if they aren't sayings or the way sentence structures that you usually would use, that does not mean that person is wrong in using that.
Right.
And also taking into account how are they using it? What are they trying to convey with that?
I think overall there's lots of different examples, and I think we're going to do an Instagram post with some more AAVE rules just to give you guys some more examples. But I think what it really boils down to is when we are in professional or even just life settings in general, we need to be more open to the idea that what people are saying, how people are saying it, is not a reflection of their intelligence. It could just be a reflection of their cultural background. And what we need to do is be more open to, like Catrice was saying earlier, listen to understand versus listening to respond. And that's how we build bridges. This is how we do the daily work of becoming more inclusive and really creating spaces that are welcoming to everyone and not just your standard, what you view as like correct. And I think that that's a really important thing. And I think it's also important for like people who are in the Black community to really kind of take back some of the ownership of our culture and our language. I think it was really beautiful for me getting to do some of the research for this episode and recognize that, like, things that I thought was really quirky about me and my family actually has a deeper roots in history that allowed me to feel almost like more connected, I guess you could say, in a way
Yeah,
that, like, yeah, like, hey, this is a part of my culture. Like, this isn't just like a weird quirk that I need to like teach myself out of. This is like something that's deeply rooted in a bigger story and a bigger history. And that doesn't make me any less educated, doesn't make me any less professional, any less serious. And so I think it's really important for us to start really fully stepping into who we are and not being afraid to check people and on the other direction, when people are like, hey, you can't use the habitual be, that's not proper English, and be like, actually, I'm gonna learn you. Here's
actually.
some information.
No, and I love that. And I think like ultimate something in the online space that we push so often is, how to sound uniquely you, being authentic to you. And when we are diminishing language like AAVE, we are erasing whole way of speaking. We are
Yeah.
taking away people's ability to actually show up uniquely themselves. You don't want your copy and your marketing to sound the same. That's not the goal. And so I think that that's like another piece of it is like the beauty of embracing the different way that people speak and allows us to one just like have I mean I love like hearing about like the history because like language does have so much stories, like even like looking at I I'm on Duolingo, I'm learning Spanish, even though I took years of Spanish in high school and everything, but like language has a story and there's such a deep history in the way that we speak, whether it is, you know, your main American English to AAVE to if you're speaking Portuguese or Mandarin and like the different things. And I think that what a beautiful thing that we all get to partake in that, especially in the online space, and be able to learn through our marketing and the copy and the messaging that people have, but also what a beautiful way to represent your culture and like your ancestry with that.
Yeah, that is really beautiful. And I think it's an opportunity for us to continue to grow and evolve and just really take in the fact that there's lots of different ways of doing things. There's lots of different ways to speak. There's lots of different ways to coach. And there's no universal correct way. And that it's okay to be open to learning from other people and their experiences. And just because somebody does something one way doesn't mean that you have to do it that way. So if you hear one of your clients or someone in your life speaking AAVE and you're like, that's just not for me, then baby girl, you don't have to use it, and that's okay. Everybody doesn't have to speak Southern twang. Everybody doesn't have to have a Midwestern accent, and everybody doesn't have to speak AAVE, but that doesn't take away from the people who are doing it, and it doesn't make you less than if you aren't. And so I think just really rephrasing within ourselves and within their cultures that we're creating within our programs, this space of being like, hey, we do things differently, and that's okay. And I'm going to learn from you, and I'm going to take what I need, and I'm going to leave what I don't. And there's nothing wrong with that. And hopefully vice versa. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be a place where we're constantly having to try to correct or micromanage someone, especially on their language. And it doesn't have to be a thing where we are constantly judging people based off of how they're showing up and how they're speaking. It can just be another, connection builder versus something that we're using to assign value to.
And I think with that, I think they're ready for a heart check, Brianna.
Yeah. So this season, I wanted to leave you guys with heart checks that kind of just, I'm going to give you some questions, and I just kind of want you to ponder and see what comes up for you. So for this episode, I want you to be thinking about what assumptions have you made about someone's intelligence based on how they speak? When do you feel the need to adjust how you speak to be taken seriously? Or do you? And why? Have you ever corrected someone's language without understanding its cultural context? How did that go? How did it make you and them feel? And where have you equated professional with sounding a certain way? And how can you start breaking those molds? And, these are very personal questions that everybody's going to have different answers. And I don't want you to be focused on having the correct answer. I want you to be focused on how did the answers to these questions make you feel, and what steps do you need to do to move forward to get to a better place, to either continue the behavior if it was a good feeling, or maybe change the behavior if it was an uncomfortable feeling.
Amazing. That's beautiful. And with that, that's a wrap. And just remember, everyone, it's a-okay to still be on a path of learning. That's exactly why we created this podcast, because ultimately that is the goal. Whether you are taking this heart check and you're being like, wait, I need to make some changes, or you're taking it and you're like, okay, I'm doing really well. Just remember, this is a space, again, for nuance, but also for learning and to create those connections. And we're so glad for you to be here. And we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye, friends. Friends, thanks so much for joining us today.
We've loved getting to spend this time here with you, but don't let the conversation stop here. Drop us a message or connect with us on social media. All the details can be found in the show notes,
along with some great resources to help you on this journey of helping make the coaching industry more inclusive. Until next time, we're 3 Black women
and their white coach,
doing the work, holding the space, and building something better.